Hello and welcome to the ID Talk podcast. I'm Alex Perala. I'm here with my co-host Tony Bitzionis. Hello, Tony.
Yo,
And today we have another conversation with Jay Meier from FaceTec, kind of a follow-up to our most recent episode. He was chatting with us last week about his concept of biometric binding. And he's back to kind of expand on that. And this time in our conversation, he went more into detail about what exactly it looks like and what the problem is with relying on device biometrics and not properly linking somebody's biometrics to the issuing authorities file that they have
Mhm.
that they use as the basis for your identity. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, definitely stay tuned because we really go in depth. It was a good conversation, a good opportunity to follow up and ask him to elaborate on some stuff that he mentioned last time. I would particularly was interested in what he had to say about Utah's DMV, which is using biometrics for its mobile driver's license and like how that data was stored and why I won't succeed in hacking usable data. So that was all illuminating and probably saved me a bunch of time. So yeah, really interesting. Always a thought-provoking conversation with Jay. Uh, what did you think, Tony?
Yeah, I agree. I think it was great to have that follow up to our previous chat with him, and to kind of get a better grasp on the idea behind binding and its importance. Not that I didn't understand it the first time around, but I think the more Jay talks about this stuff, the more its importance kind of clicks in my head and kind of that light bulb goes on, and I can understand why he's so passionate about it.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And if anyone who's listening is not sure who Jay Meyer is, first of all, definitely go back and listen to the previous episode before this one because it's a really good place to start to understand today's conversation. But he's an influential guy in the industry. He's FaceTec's SVP of North American operations. He's also involved with the Cantera initiative and with the Identity Theft Resource Center. So he's a very active and, as I said, influential voice in the industry, and always has an interesting perspective to bring to bear on important topics. So that's coming up. Before we get to that, we always like to highlight any big news items we think are important. I don't have a huge one this week, except I just want to clarify uh, from my perspective, some confusion about the deadline for the European Union's biometric entry-exit system.
Mhm.
Long anticipated, oft delayed. A lot of outlets are currently saying that it'll be implemented November 10th, saying that that's the official date. I don't think it is. There was a EU official who recently said that's the date it'll go live, and people have really run with that. But I think she just said that in a speech somewhere, and
Mhm.
the EU, the European Commission itself, afterward, through a spokesperson, said, we haven't set a date. And they were pretty emphatic about that. Although I think they did say it's on track for this autumn. And then separately, another outlet, The Independent, which has had kind of the inside scoop on this stuff in the past, they reported that November 17th was being held as like a backup option in case November 10th doesn't work out. So my money is on even later than that, just based on the many times I have written about it being delayed, but who knows? Maybe it'll go live on the November 10th and I'll be impressed personally if that happens.
My money's with your money.
Yeah, I think we don't have inside info, but I'm gonna say it's a safe bet that it'll be
Yeah,
delayed again.
I think so.
Yeah, so that's it from me. Tony, do you have any news you want to highlight?
I certainly do, and it's my now weekly reminder that Identity Week America is coming up. It is, in fact, in just over a week from now, September 11th and 12th. That's Wednesday, September 11th and Thursday, September 12th in Washington, D.C. And we will be there and we will be speaking. And I don't want to speak for you, but I will. And I'll say that we're very excited and looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's really exciting. There's a lot of buzz about it. We have some big news ourselves that we're getting ready to announce. So yeah, it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. Meanwhile, let's get to the conversation with Jay.
Yeah. All right, and we're back with Jay Meier from FaceTec. Jay, welcome back to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure.
Jay, we talked to you recently about a number of topics, and we left off on a pretty interesting note that I'd like to continue on, if that's okay with you. We were talking about the issues associated with relying on-device biometrics. You mentioned Face ID and fingerprint recognition, but I think the natural follow-up to that would be, what is the answer to that? Because, you mentioned a big problem is the biometrics may be securely stored on a device, but they're not bound to a specific
identity data.
Yeah.
We don't know whose biometric data it is, and it can be swapped out. So
yeah. So
just because it's there doesn't mean you know who's in control of the phone.
Yeah, and that seems like a pretty big problem. So
it's a big problem. We're binding more and more privileges to these phones.
Yeah.
I mean, Apple and Fido and whoever else, their mantra is everything needs to be bound to the phone, right? Well, that's great, except if you don't know who's in control of the phone, you can't know who's in control of the stuff that's bound to the phone, right? So that's simple.
I mean, we all use our phones for a lot of things, and it's
important things.
And I'm sweating a little bit. So what's the how do we how do we reduce the reliance on or solve this problem?
Well,
I mean,
biometrics are any trust factor, right? A credential is a trust factor. Possession of something is a trust factor. A biometric is a trust factor. Passwords, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Any trust factor or authenticator or credential that is not derived from a physical human being can be transferred to and used by someone else, right? And that is the nature of about 85% of cybersecurity incidents and online frauds today, is exactly that. Anytime you hear, quote, compromised credentials, what they're saying is somebody, an unauthorized person, was allowed to access privileges by using a credential they weren't entitled to. Okay?
Yeah.
And so the biometrics on the phone, a lot of companies don't even understand what's wrong with that. What's weak about it. Well, there are alternatives, right? If it's not the device native biometric, you have to use biometrics because it's the only thing derived from a human being. But what biometric and what architecture is critically important at this point, right? So let's talk about third-party biometrics, right? There are a lot of companies that have developed biometric matching and liveness and matching systems. Many of them are just hodgepodge together from free software that they can get, for example, from Amazon, right? You can use Amazon's face matching system. It's effectively free, and it's about as good as you should expect from free. Okay, it's junk, right? But they build that algorithm into their system, and they can match your face through an app or somewhere else. They can match your face against a picture or some stored value somewhere. And the question at that point is, how accurate is it, right? How well does the liveness work? How accurate is the matching? And for the vast majority of third-party biometric capabilities, the liveness is garbage and the matching is very weak. Okay. So let's take a look at, just think about the Pixel 8, I think it is, that just came out, right? The Google issued specifications, biometric performance specifications for third-party vendors that want to develop a biometric system to work on that device, right? And they said, pretty sure, you don't quote me legally on this, but I believe they said that the liveness, accuracy, the false accept rate cannot be worse than 7%, right? Which is garbage. That is horribly bad, okay? And the reason it's horribly bad is because the hackers will figure out how to get through it. And once they do that, that's the only attack they're going to use, right? So if it was a 7% false accept rate, once they figure out how to break it, that 7% goes to 10% false accept, 20% false accept, 50% false accept, because the hackers are using the same exact attack every time. So the percentage of all attacks goes way up, right?
Right.
So that's garbage. Secondly, the specification says that at a 10% false reject rate, they will allow a 1 in 25,000 false accept rate. So if you break that down, it means that 10% of the time, the system is allowed to deny the right person. The false reject rate is an indication of how often an approved person is turned away erroneously, right? So the false reject rate of 10%. So you might say, oh, that's okay. 1 out of every 10 times, I'm gonna have to do it twice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the offset to that is the false accept rate, right? The false accept rate of 1 in 25,000, which the false accept rate means how often does the system let the wrong person in? Okay. Yeah. And there's a trade-off. False reject rate and false accept rate are kind of inversely related, right?
Yeah.
If you design your system so that the correct person is never denied,
right,
it means that you are going to allow the wrong person in more often.
right.
Okay. And the inverse is also correct. So the standard for this is the industry standard for comparing biometric systems, like what they do at NIST, okay, is they set the false reject rate, they fix it at 1%. And at 1% false reject, what is the false accept rate? Okay, so you get a sense of, we know how often the right person is denied, so how often does the wrong person get in, right?
Right.
So if the false accept rate is really high at a 1% false reject rate, it sucks, right? Because it pretty much lets anyone in. If the false reject rate is very low, right, it almost never lets the wrong person in at a 1% false reject rate. The false accept rate is very low at a 1% false reject rate. The technology is working very, very well, okay? Yeah. And you can compare systems. So Google's specification of a 10% false reject rate is 10 times worse than the benchmark.
Well, it sounds like, I just want to clarify, because it sounds like what you're saying is that if you look at even Google's own standards, they're very weak for authentication on the device.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, going back to Tony's question, what's the solution to this on-device issue? It sounds almost like you're saying that the issue is that the standards aren't good enough, but I feel like that's actually not.
It's not the standards, okay? That's what I'm talking about, is a benchmark, the 1% false reject rate versus the whatever the false accept rate is. That's kind of a benchmark so that everybody is being measured from the same basis. Okay.
Right, yeah.
But when you compare what Google is allowing for their systems, their third-party biometric vendors that are going to presumably match your face on the Pixel 8, their system is so inaccurate relative to even the benchmarking standard that it's laughable. Okay.
Yeah.
The liveness false accept rate is completely unacceptable, because once the bad guy figures out how to do it, they're going to do that over and over and over and over again. So the percentage of false accepts goes way up.
So what my question is, why?
On top of that, I'm sorry, but on top of that, the accuracy rate is garbage. I mean, not only does it deny the real person way more often than it should, but it allows the wrong person in way more often than it should. So let me give you just a comparison. Okay. We were recently tested in Australia for a government deployment that we did. And at a 1% false reject rate, we had roughly a false accept rate of roughly 1 in 125,000. Okay. And that was live capture on the fly. People just, it wasn't in a fixed laboratory environment. That was just people out in the field comparing their faces. So,
So why? I mean, first of all, it sounds like Google or Apple or whomever are not, I'm thinking of it in terms of every time I try to unlock my phone with my face, right? And there are times where it doesn't work and it's a frustrating experience. And it might be 1 in 10. And yeah, whatever, lighting and blah, 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 your camera is smudged, all that stuff. But
your clay mask.
The clay mask that I wear all the time, just to keep my skin looking so great.
Cucumbers on your eyes.
All that stuff.
If you can get in with cucumbers on your eyes, you got a real problem. You got a bad system.
I haven't tested that yet, but I will next spa day. But so why are these companies, why is Google settling for such a crappy inverse? Is it to not have their users complaining about how often it doesn't work? Because that doesn't,
I can't speak for Google and their engineers and their policy makers, right? But we can speculate a little bit about why they would do that, right? First of all, they want to ensure that they don't encumber people more than is necessary, right? Let's just take it one step back for a second. The fact that there is biometric systems being used at all can kind of give a false sense of security, right? I mean, even IDV vendors and a lot of companies that are doing biometric, they boast about having biometrics. Oh, we use biometrics. So they don't tell you that it's the device native biometrics, and they don't tell you what their accuracy rates are, right? So 99.99999% of the people out there hear, oh, biometrics, it's got to be secure, right? And the vendors, if the vendors even understand why what they are saying is just garbage, the people that they're saying it to don't understand that it's garbage, okay? So it becomes a selling feature, right? Apple made biometrics cool. The second thing is that if you scrutinize the person holding the phone too rigorously, it makes it too difficult, too much friction for the actual owner of the phone. Okay. And that's what makes this so laughable. The Google specs so laughable is because their false accept rate is not all that high, first of all, but their false reject rate is still 10%. They still allow 10%, 1 in 10 times. I mean, if that's how they're going to reduce friction on their customers and on the people that own the phone, they've really done a bad job of it, So they don't want to inhibit revenue generation. That's what this is really all about. They're trying to balance the perception that they have a secure device, right, with the free-flowing economics of putting apps on phones and collecting data and selling people's information, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's really all about.
That does make a lot of sense, because if you ever watch one of their, Google I/O or Apple, I forget what Apple's WWF, I can't remember what it's called. Their big annual conferences, when they unveil new phones or new operating systems or updates, they will often talk about the secure chips that they have. I think Google's is called like the Titan whatever. And I know Samsung had a partition years ago that would lock your sensitive data on this specific chip. And that's usually the focus of the security aspect of OS updates or phone
The
upgrades.
secure enclave is what Apple calls it. Some
Yeah.
other organizations
And
call
they'll
it something
mention
else.
biometrics, and they'll say, oh, Face ID has infrared, or Face Unlock has blah, 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 or the fingerprint sensors are under the screen now, and they're faster, but they never really make that connection between the biometrics and the security. They just say, to the point that you've been making, both last time you were on and now, is that, yeah, they're capturing the biometrics and maybe it's faster and maybe it's more convenient for you, but they're still storing it on the device. And
well, here's the thing, so I have two daughters, right? And I don't know about you, but I almost never text while I drive, but I have texted while I drive. And we all know that it's a really stupid thing to do, right?
Yeah.
It's a distraction. That's why it's against the law universally. But people still do it, right?
Why I don't drive.
My teenage daughter texts while she drives, right? Scares the heck out of me, right?
Yeah.
So if you're interacting with your device while you're driving around and you had to enter an 8-digit PIN or some, alphanumeric sequence, you have to stare at the screen and enter the numbers.
Yeah.
That means your eyes are off the road for as long as it takes to enter that information, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if they could put their finger on a fingerprint sensor or just put the phone in front of their face, it could be instantaneous. So their eyes aren't on the road so often. No, I'm not saying this is specifically why they're doing it, but the biometric technologies are much more convenient than asking people to add
Put in a PIN.
enter their PIN.
Even remember
Makes
their
sense?
PIN or remember their password. Yeah.
Well,
But-
that's right. So
If we could zoom out a bit, what I was trying to get at before was about this issue of binding, because I feel like we're talking like this issue about biometric accuracy, authentication accuracy. That's important, but from what I understood you to be saying earlier about binding, even if it were extremely reliable and accurate, it still doesn't solve the fundamental issue, which is of binding credentials to a device rather than to the person, right? Like if you're authenticating with your phone, even if it's facial recognition is great, there's still the fundamental issue, is there not? That it's not
still right. So the problem out there, again, like 85% of the problem out there, and the problem is gargantuan, right? Billions, if not trillions of dollars of fraud and all that stuff. The problem is compromised credentials. Okay. And that means that a bad person is able to take advantage of a valid credential that is owned by someone else. Right. By default, that means the problem is that we don't have enough binding between the credential and the actual owner of the credential. Okay. So the PKI fallacy is all about, we can bind everything you want to a device and we can bind it irrefutably. We could bind an irrefutable cryptographic document to a device and know 100% certainty that it's legit. But if we don't know who's in control of the device, we have no idea who's in control of the credentials that are bound to the device, and by extension, the privileges that are represented by those credentials. Okay. So the solution to to 85% of this gargantuan problem out there is improving the binding between a real human being, the legitimate human being and the credential that describes their identity and the privileges associated with it, right? If the binding was more secure, other people wouldn't be able to use it.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with anonymous biometrics, is it doesn't actually bind a human being to the device or the credentials associated with the device. On the third-party biometrics typically are such garbage, like as exemplified by the Pixel 8 specs, that it doesn't really bind anything because almost anybody can get through it, right? So the key is having extremely high quality, extremely high accuracy, extremely high confidence, biometric liveness, and biometric matching through. And then when you enroll somebody in a system to get a driver's license or to get a bank account or to work at a company, right? We all work remotely to more or less extent. If the employer collected a biometric, a liveness proven, super accurate, high confidence biometric from that applicant or the person that is being enrolled in human resources, and bound that biometric to the employee file, okay, which is largely electronic today, they bind it to the employee file. They know the biometric came from that employee. They know who the employee is. So every time the employee wants to access the network, they can use that biometric to compare against the one that's a fresh biometric collected from the device, right? Or wherever. And that's compared to the one that's previously bound and verified in the employee profile, right? So if it says yes, the only thing you're worried about is the biometric matching good enough that we can have a high enough degree of confidence that this guy standing there is actually the guy that submitted the biometric in the first place, right? So if it's junk like Google, you can't have that confidence. But if it's really good, like liveness proven 3D face that we have, so the goal is, hey, everybody, here's the tip. The goal is to raise the confidence that we can have in knowing the person claiming to be someone is, in fact, that person, as close to perfection as we can. It can't be perfect. There's always going to be it's never going to be 100%, but it could be 99.99999%, right? Which might be good enough. Make sense?
Yeah, you kind of answered a question I had from the last time we were talking, because you were talking about.
I remembered that question. I was trying to work it in.
No, this is good. You had talked about Utah, FaceTec's work with Utah, and the mobile driver's license effort there. And so I was going to ask, like, is it that you're going to be relying on DMV to determine who control that? Like, they need to control someone's identity data, but you just gave the example of an employer registering somebody's biometric data and using that. So it sounds like the approach is really, you're saying, like, whichever body needs to know who someone is, whichever organization it is, it doesn't have to be like a government authority. It could be a business.
It could be a bank. You sign up for a bank account at a bank. If they took your 3D face map, your liveness proven 3D face map, and bound it to the account profile, the customer profile, when you get the account, when you enroll in the first place, then they have a biometric that they know for sure came from the guy that's represented by that account. So now they can authenticate the guy by capturing his live face when he's trying to get into the account against the stored biometric that was collected and we know came from the right guy. And if it matches, it's the guy that's authorized to use the account, right? So, we're talking about issuing authorities, right? A bank could be an issuing authority if you want to think of it that way. But more traditionally, we think of issuing authorities as government organizations or highly trusted organizations that to hold verified identity data. So, like a Department of Motor Vehicles. Okay, in the United States, I know you guys are north of the border, but in the United States, we don't have a national ID card, right? The state driver's license or state issued ID card is sort of the de facto national ID, right? Which has its own set of problems because they're not all the same, right? But the highest confidence identity data that exists about you is what's stored in your profile at the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? I mean, when you apply for a mortgage, the bank wants to see your driver's license, okay? That's because that driver's license represents the highest possible confidence we can have that the identity is legitimate, right? This person actually exists out there. And so we're proving it by providing evidence that that person is in this database. This US State Department is another example of one. National ID card issuers in other countries are other examples of one, right? So those sources of identity data are considered the best, highest quality, lowest risk sources of identity data about individual people. Okay. Well, the problem is that driver's licenses are now being faked as often as they're real, right? And the people are using fake credentials all over the place to misrepresent who they are, right? If you're buying beer, underage people buying beer on Friday night, it's the same thing. They're using a legitimate credential that represents a privilege to buy liquor, but they're not the person represented by the credential, okay? If you had a fake credential and with your identity data on it, but my face, I could enroll in a bank for a bank account and they would think that I am you. And from that point on, they would recognize me as the official account holder, but it would all be on your back because I'd be effectively stealing money from you, right? So the stuff that's out in the field is not reliable anymore. The driver's licenses themselves are not reliable anymore because they're as often fake as not. The reliable data is in the database at the DMV, at the State Department, at the National ID, right? They always have a picture, and that's the attempt to bind a physical human being to that identity. That's why the picture's on your driver's license, right? But unless you have the best biometric system set up in the right way, matching an image of a face from a driver's license against somebody that's standing there or sitting there doesn't work very well. People are really bad at it, and the biometric systems, as we know, the third-party biometric systems are frequently junk, okay? So the key is being able to bind biometric data to the identity profile at the issuing authority and make it usable out in the field. Okay. So in Utah, for example, when you get a driver's license, when you get a mobile driver's license, they capture a 3D face scan, which is liveness and matching data. They check for liveness. If this person is alive, then they delete the liveness data, leaving what we call a face map, which is just biometric matching data. And that face map is bound to the mobile ID profile at the DMV. Right. Okay. So when this person wants to renew their driver's license or get other online services potentially, they can use their face. They can collect another 3D face scan, do a liveness check, convert it to a 3D face map, and match the face map against what's bound to the driver's license profile. So and at that point, it's the same person.
Does in that example, does the Utah DMV have the face map, or yeah, they like store it they store that somewhere?
Utah, I believe, stores a 3D face map. It's bound to the identity profile. Now, you know, many places don't want to store that kind of biometric data, right? In New South Wales, we have a deployment that they will not store third-party biometric data in their database. They have a 2D image of that person, right? So our system will match the 3D face map against the image that's there. So we say 3D to 2D, right? It's not as accurate as 3D to 3D, not even close, but it's way more accurate than 2D to 2D.
Right.
Makes sense? So they're still way better off, right? And they still get the best liveness available, right? So we can do both. And in that point, they get the 3D face map, they match it against the 2D image on file, and then they delete the 3D face map. So they're not actually storing it.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah. Because Alex sounded a little nefarious when he asked where the data is stored. I don't know what his intentions are, but so this might be a dumb question, but in the case of a hack, because it's based on liveness, is your stolen information, your hacked information, is it less compromised?
No. I mean, so here's the thing. The big scare tactic out there is that if you have a database full of biometric data, as if your picture isn't biometric data. I mean, the picture used on your driver's license is biometric data. That's how we bind you, the physical human, to the credential and the identity profile. So it is. It's just a different form factor. But if you had biometric template data there, right, 3D face maps that are bound to the identity profile, could somebody steal the 3D face maps and use them to bad ends, right? Could they use it inappropriately? And that's called a honeypot. And that's the big screaming objection out there, is that somebody could, doesn't matter if it's FaceTec or any other biometric vendor, if there's biometric data stored in a database, somebody could swoop in and take it all and use that biometric data to misrepresent themselves as someone they are not and steal identities. And then they say, oh, your fingerprint can't be changed, you know? Well, it's stupid, okay? It's a poorly thought out objection. First of all, encryption works, right? If you go out and find some database that was hacked and the biometric data was stolen, there's a very, very high chance that it's because the database administrator forgot to turn on the encryption. Okay. At the heart of all this is whether or not the data is usable. Okay. That's the key. It's not about honeypot. The issue is the data usable? If they steal biometric data, can they use it for any type of gain, right? So there's decentralized systems. Everybody, that's a new buzzword. Oh, it's decentralized. You know, nobody even knows what the hell decentralized means, right? Does it mean it's not in a central database? Well, yeah, kinda, except if we define decentralized as a series of centralized databases that are networked together. So if they hack one of the databases, they're not hacking all of the databases. So that's decentralized, right? Or are they shredding the data into pieces, encrypting it, and then storing the pieces in other places to be reconstituted later upon demand? That's also decentralized, okay? Both of those, you know, so you got cryptography, you got decentralization. The goal is to make it so you can't use the information that you stole, right? Well, there's other ways to do this, right? That you can make data, including biometric data. Well, you can make biometric data unusable despite the fact that it's in a centralized database. And the key is changing the data file. You alter the data so that it can't be resubmitted, right? It would be like trying to submit, you know, a file that's in one computer language to an operating system that's based on a different computer language. Okay. So for example, at FaceTec, we capture a 3D face scan from the device, which is one file that contains liveness data and matching data, all commingled. It's all wound together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's encrypted, sent to the DMV where it's decrypted behind their firewall, where you check for liveness. If the person is deemed to be alive, then we delete the liveness data, which alters the file. Okay, we change the file completely. What is left is called a 3D face map, which is matching data. That's what's bound to the profile. That's the data that could be stolen by somebody. But what if they had a 3D face map? Could they resubmit it? No, they can't resubmit it because the system is looking for a file that has different data in it. It has to have the liveness data and the matching data together and time-stamped appropriately, right?
Yeah.
So if they try and submit a 3D face map, it will be rejected, which means the 3D face map data is worthless, which means why would somebody steal worthless data? Go ahead, steal it if you think you can, You can't use it for anything. Again,
so if Alex does try to hack the Utah DMV, and I lived in Utah, my data would be more or less useless to him.
The 3D face map that presumably is bound to your driver's license data.
Yeah.
I mean, your driver's license data, name, address, all that kind of stuff, eye color, whatever, that could be useful if it's not encrypted, I suppose. That's already out there. I mean, it's almost not like it's new information to anybody.
Go ahead, Alex.
I don't get your identity.
I don't have a driver's license, so Alex, do what you will.
It sounds like I can still get something out of this, but
yeah,
just the biometric data is out of reach once again. So fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that the biometric data, you hope the biometric data is out of reach, but more importantly, it's useless. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whether it's shredded into pieces and the pieces are stored in remote locations, any one of those pieces is useless, right? If it's fully encrypted, it's just gibberish information that they'd be stealing, X's and O's and A's and B's and C's and whatever else. It's useless, right?
Yeah.
You alter the data file so that what you bind to the verified profile is different than what is required to be submitted. The information is useless, right?
Yeah.
Back to the drawing board.
You keep swinging, guys.
Well, on that note, Jay, it's always a pleasure talking with you. You really know what you're talking about, and I have to take notes whenever you're talking. So thanks once again for spending some time with us.
It's a good thing you record this stuff because you can listen to my gibberish over and over and over again and try and decipher it over time.
It's the only way we learn.
But there's a continuity here, right? We're talking over the course of these episodes, we're talking about all the different components of an identity system and what's required to make it work. And no one component, the cryptography alone doesn't work for identity security. The biometrics alone doesn't work for identity security. These things have to be joined together, right? And the nuances of all these different form factors of all of this, there's a lot that you have to understand. So by talking through all those points, hopefully people are going to get a better understanding of what really has to happen in order to secure remote unsupervised identity verification.
Yeah, I think the key there is the continuity, and we will be speaking to you again. We will be binding all of these conversations and episodes together.
Grasshopper.
I did it. I did it. I stole your joke.
Will you walk on rice paper?
Yeah.
And if you know what that means, you're old. If you know where that came from, you're old.